Small shifts can have grave consequences. I mean, really small shifts, however subtle, however inconsequential we might think that they are, small shifts can have significant consequences. And you know, the group of people that understand this best are pilots. Pilots have what's called the 1 in 60 principle. And the 1 in 60 principle says that for every 1 degree the nose of the plane is off, then every 60 miles they fly, they will be 1 mile off of their intended destination. Just 1 degree of the plane nose. And yet, the farther they go, the further they end up way far away from their destination. Now, is that their goal? Absolutely not. Sometimes they even get you. It's one of those principles where the small shift over a long period of time even leads you to places where you go, how did we get here? And sometimes that moment, how did we get here, is filled with incredible tragedy. On November 8th, 1979, there was a sightseeing plane that was flying over the Antarctic. And this plane, when it first began, the nose of the plane was only 2 degrees off. And yet the further they flew, the further away from their destination they became. The problem was that the way in which the pilots were paying attention or not paying attention, they did not know they were 2 degrees off. Until about 27 miles east of their intended destination, this plane slammed into the side of Mount Erebus, killing all 257 people on board. You see, small shifts can have grave consequences. Because even if we're off just 1 degree, the further that you travel, the further away from the distance that you intended to be. And you have this moment where you say, how in the world did I get here? This is a truth that is hard to grasp because of how subtle it is. But let me state this a little bit differently. Every decision you make, you become someone different. For good or for ill. Every decision you make, you become someone different. I teach here at Ozark Christian College, and every week that we have on syllabus week, I go over this principle. Yeah, that's right. I actually preach for a week through my syllabus. It's a little more riveting than what you would think. But I always come to this point when we talk about cheating or plagiarism. Or I talk to my students and I say, hey, listen, you will have a good opportunity to cheat in this class. And I'm not going to guilt you, but I am going to be honest with you. If you get away with it, the consequence of it will be way worse than if you just would have turned it in and got a bad grade. And then I said this, I said, being in ministry for 20 years, I've seen quite a few of my classmates that I went to Ozark with lose ministries, lose families. They lose their integrity. And I remember one of my friends recently who was cheating on his wife, and whenever it all came out, he had that question resonating in his mind, how did I get here? And one of the things that was interesting is we began to talk and reminisce about his time in the dorm. And he began to remind me of whenever he used to go around bragging about getting a B on a paper, even though he had cheated. At the end of each semester, he would laugh because he wouldn't have read any of his textbooks, and he still got good grades. But one of the things that him and I, neither one, knew back then is that he was in those decisions of deception. The nose of his plane was moving just 1 degree off. And after 15 and 20 years of traveling, he was very far away from the destination he intended to go to. Every decision you make, you become someone else. And small shifts can have grave consequences. However subtle, however seemingly benign, small shifts can lead us very far away from where we intended to be. And it is that story, it is that question, how did we get here, that's important for us to wrestle with, because that would have surely been on the hearts and the minds of the Jews in exile under Babylon in the book of Daniel. But instead of going to the book of Daniel to get the answer to that question, I want to start off in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 1, it begins in a very brutal way. It begins with God talking in a very uncharacteristic way. Because when you're reading Isaiah 1, one of the questions that you ask is, geez, God, why are you so angry? I mean, listen to how he begins in verse 10, Isaiah 1, verse 10. Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. He's talking to the nation of Israel. This is right before the exile. And Isaiah is saying things are going to go south real quick. Listen to the instruction of our God, you people of Gomorrah. He's talking to the nation of Israel. And in case you didn't know it, you don't want Sodom and Gomorrah on your resume if you're trying to apply for a job with God. The multitude of your sacrifices, verse 11. What are they to me, says the Lord? I have more than enough burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fattened animals. I have no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. When you come to appear before me, who has asked this of you, this trampling of my courts? Stop bringing meaningless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me. New moons, Sabbaths, and convocations. I cannot bear your worthless assemblies. Your new moon feasts and your appointed festivals, I hate with all of my being. They have become a burden to me, and I am weary of bearing them. Verse 15, when you spread out your hands in prayer, I hide my eyes from you. Even when you offer many prayers, I am not listening. Your hands are full of blood. So wash and make yourselves clean, verse 16. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Defend the oppressed. Take up the cause of the fatherless. Plead the case of the widow. And at this point, it'd be appropriate for us to ask, what in the world is making God so mad? Why is he so angry? Is it just because they didn't do a couple of commands that he wanted them to? No, it's more along the lines of this. Do you even know who I am? Because if you knew who I was, there is no way that you would come to me in prayer with your hands covered in the blood of the oppressed. Because I am the Father. I am the God that fights for those in bondage. I am the God that fights for those in need. And yet you slaughter them and come to me in worship. In Isaiah chapter 1, verses 2 through 3, it's the issue of identity that God hammers on. It says, hear me, you heavens. Listen, earth, for the Lord has spoken. I reared children and brought them up, but they have rebelled against me. The ox knows its master. The donkey knows its owner's manger, but Israel does not know me. My people do not understand me. When we're in the exile, a key question is, how did we get here? And here's the answer. When you forget who it is that you belong to, you will forget who you are and how to act. When you forget who God is, you forget who you are, and your actions will follow. For if you knew who God was, there is no way that you would come up to him with the blood of orphans and widows on your hands. But if you forget who he is, you might forget even what he loves, desires, and requires. You see, sometimes just 1 degree makes a big difference. Because the nation of Israel did not just rebel all at once and it lead to an exile. It was just 1 degree at a time. And the further they got down this journey, the further away from the destination of God's identity that they found themselves. And now we're in Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1 is centered on, you guessed it, identity. You see, in exile, identity is under attack. The goal of the one that has brought you into exile is to erase your very identity, to erase your history, to give you a new identity that now is defined by Babylon, is defined by the oppressor, is defined by the one who is dominating. In Daniel chapter 1, verses 3 and following, you see this reprogramming process. In verses 3 through 5, you have the chief of the court officials. He comes to each of them and he starts to, it says in verse 4, he was to teach them the language of Babylon and the literature of the Babylonians. Why? Because if I can retrain you in how you speak, it will actually impact who you are. If I can retrain you in how to think, then it will actually affect who you are. The goal is to erase your identity. And that's why you see in verses 6 and 7 that Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah also all receive new names. For Daniel is now referred to as Belteshazzar. Hananiah is Shadrach, Mishael is Meshach, and Azariah becomes Abednego. Why are they changing the names? Because the goal of exile is to erase your identity and to give you a new one. And once we get to verse 8, we start to see a little resistance. We start to see Daniel fight back just a touch. Daniel chapter 1, verse 8 says this, "But Daniel resolved, even though he was learning a new language, even though he was learning new literature, how to think, even though he even had a new name, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way." You see, Daniel can't control everything that's happening. But one of the things he can control is what he eats. And if you've read any portion of the Old Testament, you know there are a lot of laws about what to eat and what not to eat. Because on some level, God was actually using what they ate to define who they were and who they belonged to. So if Daniel changes his food, it actually is a way to solidify him losing his very identity. And I know you're thinking, food's not that big of a deal. Listen, 1 degree can make a grave difference, significant, for better or worse. And this is Daniel's 1 degree, to hold on to who he is in the midst of exile. The problem is, it puts the chief official in a very awkward situation. Because the chief official's job, and he's accountable to the king, he's accountable to Nebuchadnezzar, the chief official's job is to make sure that these new foreign people in Babylon get the proper training to become the wise men and the officials and the administrators so that they can help run Babylon as Babylonians. But if their diet does not match up to the level of the diet that Babylon requires, and this official allows them to change their food, his head could roll. And that's what he says to him. He's like, yo, this is actually a big deal. I'm required to give you this food. So Daniel and his friends, they come and they say, let's make a deal. How about for 10 days? Let's just test this for 10 days. If we stick to our diet, after 10 days, if we are starting to decline, then we will eat your food. And the chief official is like, all right, fine, 10 days. That's all I'm going to give you. Then we'll reassess it. And if it's not going well, you're going to do what I say so that I don't die. That seems fair. 10 days goes by, and what happens? Well, in verse 19, it says, the king, Nebuchadnezzar, talked with them, talking about Daniel and his friends, and he found no one equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's court. Now, don't miss the point. The point of the story is not about obedience. It's not about making sure I obey the laws of God because then good things will happen to me. That is not the point of Daniel chapter 1. The point of this story is this: identity is worth fighting for, even just 1 degree. Because whenever you're in a moment where your identity is not just threatened, but it is attacked, clinging to the identity, even through just one way, only one thing you can control, gives you the ability to endure, to triumph, to overcome in exile. Here's the point. When it comes to identity, actions matter. Even a small sin matters, and we should take it more seriously. I mean, sometimes we ask ourselves this question: how did we get here? After 25 years of marriage, how did we get to this moment where we're now experiencing a divorce? 1 degree. After 30 years of ministry, how in the world did I fall because I slept with this other person? 1 degree. After 35 years, how is it that over the last 6 years I've not talked to any of my children? 1 degree. Our actions matter because subtle shifts can have grave consequences. And over time, the further that you go on this journey, you end up further and further away from the destination you intended to go to. When it comes to identity, who you are should determine what you do, not the opposite. And if your actions don't match your identity, then maybe it's time for a change.